Firm, we have money in the bank. Our treasurer, April Hansen, got parade duties, and she works for City and County of Denver, so she was unable to be here today. But she said we are in fine financial shape as an organization. Membership report, Jackie, can you enlighten us?
You've seen the emails coming out. I'm going to steal a little bit of Brendan's thunder for a second just to make sure about signing up for members. Please sign up so that when you are a member, then you get the member rate for the conference. So make sure you're a member first with the actual organization, and then you get your member discount with Brendan.
Oh, it is me now.
Now it's time for Brendan to talk a little bit about our upcoming conference.
Okay. Conference is coming together. We had a lot of great sessions, a lot of great speakers. We just came back from national. We were talking. The state chapters are a lot better in a lot of ways to the national chapter. So, not really going to push sponsorship. I always can push sponsorship, but pretty solid. What I do need is everybody in this room to attend. All the risk managers, and bring your counterparts and your assistants and whatnot to get them involved, because Bill's going to be great this year. We have a lot of opportunities. Heather's going to early afternoon on Sunday. She's going to do yoga in the park. We got some golf set up. We got some fly fishing. We're going to go up early. We got some mountain biking. Let's see what else. Who else is in this room? Chris isn't here for the fly fishing side, but we're going to offer a lot of different opportunities to get the Bill experience.
Right.
Come join us.
Yeah. And then Brendan alluded to several of the board members went to National PRIMA, and we had a really good representation from Colorado. There were probably 10 folks from Colorado PRIMA at National. It was really well received. The sessions were all really good and informative. Our chapter, Lori and I sat in on the chapter leadership meeting. It's where all the presidents and VPs of the chapters around the country. And Colorado PRIMA, we're kind of becoming a model. People were really impressed that we have a YouTube channel that we post all of our meetings on. Thank you, Jackie, for getting that put together. Our conference coming up in Vail is being promoted on the National PRIMA website. So there may be some additional folks joining us from other states, which would be really, really fantastic for that to happen. Really getting our name out there as a chapter and trying to make Colorado one of the lead chapters in the country. Yeah, sure. Yeah, talk about membership.
So just on membership, that kind of tagging on to what Brendan said, I've been working on some different ideas, coming up with some marketing material for PRIMA, and also some material to kind of like what Jeff and Brendan put together here for the conference. So if you know somebody that is in the public entity or student with school districts or whatever, I'm hoping that I'll get these flyers out and you can just give it to them. And so when they're looking at trying to sell it to whoever they need to get the training, which is only $50 a year for the membership, but we want to give them something that they can hand and say, this is why I want to be part of PRIMA. So definitely keep your eye out for that. But my name and email and number are also on the website. So if you have any questions about membership, or if you're like, hey, I know somebody that you should reach out to, please shoot me an email. That'd be great. Because we really want to get all of our wonderful things that we have to offer out to these maybe smaller entities that don't know we exist and don't know they have this option, especially with cyber and all the other things we're experiencing. We want to reach out to people and make sure that they know that they have this other resource. That's all I have to say about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Jessica. Kind of open up a little open discussion. Does anyone have any new claims or any case law updates for us? Technical folks, have you seen anything crazy happen recently? That's a loaded question. Yeah. I mean, Jen's going to talk about the legislation, so. You have a good claim, Krista?
Oh, yeah, we got a couple.
Got a couple? Well, I have one.
They're very new, so
They're
we'll
very
talk
new.
about those. Right
Mine's not a claim, but I need to get some help from fellow risk managers here in the room. I got an email this morning from our treasurer's office. They want to teach their employees Krav Maga for self-defense.
Oh my God.
Okay? So, So, welcome to my world.
Wait, talk about how long the class is, too. How much training are they getting, Jeff?
They're getting a 2-hour training course on self-defense.
Oh, yeah.
They're gonna learn problem on 2 hours.
Yeah, and no follow-up practice. So,
Run like 5, I mean,
as a risk manager, how would you respond to that request coming from an elected official?
no.
That was basically the short answer, but that probably won't fly.
They can do it on their own.
That's-
Can't be on our own time.
Right. That's, I mean, my thoughts went immediately to, well, at least they're not giving them guns. That's a good thing. But, you know, what is our liability if we're providing the training, we're paying for it, they're doing work, doing it on work time, and then, you know, they're not very experienced, only having 1 2-hour class. And one of our employees really beats somebody up badly and doesn't know when to stop. What's our liability? So, welcome to the world of Larimer County.
They want to teach self-defense to our kids in the curriculum, hands-on.
Really?
See,
Really?
good work.
Reading, writing, and
Again, Lorraine, I'll beat you.
that's one step up. Reading, writing, and beat up your fellow students, huh?
Catholic author was more about running lessons, situations.
I just know it from the Israeli military training. That's their preferred method of handling of combat. So, I will take any suggestions. Y'all have my email, so I'm willing to do.
So what's happening at your treasurer's office?
Well, they're concerned.
People are
Well, I
happening.
don't know. I know there's, one of their main concerns is when they're going out and tagging properties for failure to pay property taxes. And they're going out to people's residences.
Okay.
They're a bit uneasy. And I would think they could take law enforcement if they were really worried. That would make more sense than send an office worker with 2 hours of training to defend themselves, but.
And no policies.
And no policies. So, yeah. Oh, I thought you were waiting, I thought you were gonna, I thought you were gonna offer suggestions here.
He's looking for another chair to sit in.
Oh. All right.
Hey Jeff, I think you have more of a work comp.
Well, I think we definitely have a work.
Liability, I can see maybe a little bit of liability. We do this all the time. So I always have my safety person there to make sure that there's nothing goes awry.
Mark, you're going to crop
And
shop.
they're very, there you go. Just to make sure that we have outside eyes looking in to make sure that there's nothing that gets out of control. But we do this all,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I was figuring we'll get a couple claims from the training.
Absolutely. Guaranteed.
Here, I mean, whenever our sheriffs do training, we get 10 claims.
Yep. Is it gonna be mandatory?
What's that?
Going to be mandatory or just optional?
I don't know yet. My guess is probably mandatory.
That.
Yeah. So we're owning it one way or another, whatever.
Make them
I
do
think
the
they need a
policies.
vicious
That'll
dog
shut it
to
down.
help them. Which is
That
joking.
brings its own.
Yeah, that brings its own set of problems, having the dog. All right. Well, does anyone else have any other fun stories that'll top that one? All right, so I guess we can move on in our agenda. Under new business, anybody have any new business, new things going on in their entity that they want to talk about? I think Brennan's.
You know, we always talk about doom and gloom, right? And I got my share of that as well. But I'm going to tell you a good story. We have a safety team. We invest some of the money from the safety team to help the police, not fire, but for this situation, it's police. We purchased through the safety team these life vac units for our police officers, and we saved a 6-month-old last month. And they're PRIMA. And we're sitting there having lunch, and my emergency manager texts me and says, we saved a life. So that's pretty cool.
That's
But,
awesome.
yeah, and Narcan's been a huge success in the city for us as well. Yeah, we've had 9 saves this year with that. But yeah, I want to spend the positive side of this, man. I mean, I can tell you all doom and gloom all day, but yeah.
Well, that's great news. Anyone else have anything to share? Lori?
So, My safety committee has been, will be receiving the CIRSA Safety Champion Award. And that's especially exciting for us because a few years ago, we didn't really have a safety committee. And this group of folks has done a really great job of building a safety culture. They make videos that are sometimes humorous, sometimes serious. They, we designate National Safety Month now. We have a program where we take the loss control credits and let people apply for grants to do safety projects. And so I was really excited that they got chosen for this award.
She's a one-man show. Yeah. That's pretty impressive, so learn from that.
Great. Any other things that, for the group, other new business, exciting things going on in your entities? All right, well, I see Jennifer has stepped out for a phone call. Oh, she's back. Awesome. I was going to try to kill time, do a little song and dance. Introduce our first speaker today, Jennifer Castle of Castle and Bowditch Public Affairs. Her firm is the lobbyist group for the Colorado Self-Insurance Association. They do a lot of fantastic work down at the Capitol for that group. And she's here to apprise us and give us an update on what happened at the most recent legislative session. A lot regarding some of the workers' comp bills that came through, and then the infamous restrooms with amenities for all bill that I know will have effect to on those of us that are tasked with ADA compliance in your organization. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer for her presentation.
Thank you. All but the front one's going? Okay. I don't know.
Oh, I got your tweet right now.
There we go.
Sorry.
I realized both of
Just the
your
front, the side ones are on, she's the front ones not.
both of your speakers today have the same last name.
Right, the Castle.
Yeah.
Spelled differently.
Spelled differently.
There was a lot.
Yeah. Everybody thinks I'm Cassell. Anyway, it's good to be here. Thank you. And I see a lot of friendly faces. So it's nice to see a lot of you as well, too. So I'm going to mention a little bit about what happened last legislative session. It feels like it was months ago, at least for me, just because what had happened. Okay, perfect. There we go. So I'll talk a little bit about the session, talk about some of the major policy bills, and then, of course, get a little bit specific with some work comp bills and maybe some other bills that could be of interest to you all as risk managers. So the legislative session did end May 8th, so a little bit more than a month ago. And to give some of you a background, and I know the self-insurers know a lot of this information, so I don't know exactly how much background you all have, so please stop me or ask me questions if I need to explain more. But to give you some background of what we're dealing with down at the Capitol, and with this background you can probably take a guess of some of that legislation that was introduced during this session, right? So the makeup of the legislature, we are operating under a Democratic trifecta. So this past election, or I should say November of 2022, really expanded the Democratic majorities that the Democrats have down at the Capitol. That was completely not expected, right? So we now have a supermajority in the House of Democrats, 46-19, and close to a supermajority in the Senate of 23-12. And then Governor Polis is a Democrat as well too. So you could probably assume and think that a lot of progressive legislation was introduced, and it was. Not as much progressive legislation actually passed the full session, which is a little bit surprising as well. But we continue to see diversity down at the Capitol as it relates to legislators' age, race, sexual identity, kind of all of the above. So it is certainly becoming more and more diverse. We had 34 new legislators after the election in November of 2022. That is a staggering amount. That's a third of the legislature. There's 100 total legislators at the Capitol. So a lot of newbies were down there, and that kind of dictated some of the activities that happened down at the Capitol. Certainly a challenge, also an opportunity to develop relationships with legislators. And I don't know if you all know, legislators are term limited in Colorado. 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate. So a total of 16 years any one person can serve, right? So a lot of themes that we saw, as you can imagine, social justice issues, which has been a continuing national issue, always trickles down to Colorado. Again, a lot of new legislators. And I think we saw a couple of things with that. One, yes, there was a ton of party line votes. And I think a lot of that was because with so many brand new legislators, quite frankly, they were just a little intimidated. They didn't quite know what else to do except to vote with their party, right? I am hoping, and actually I do believe that we will see, maybe not so much next year because it's an election year and things are going to get very political down at the Capitol, but I think you'll start seeing more legislators break away from their parties once they get a little more comfortable, once they start developing who they are as a legislator, you know, that kind of thing. So with so many new members, you saw a lot of just, hey, I'm just going to vote yes because, you know, my buddy who's a Democrat is sponsoring that bill, right? So that kind of attitude. Also, what was a little bit disappointing is that because of those big majorities the Democrats had, especially on the House side, you did not see very much engagement from a lot of those new members. Again, sure, it could have been some intimidation. The Capitol is an intimidating place, especially when you're beholden to the public, right? But I think they just felt like they didn't have to engage, that they didn't have to understand a lot of issues that were down at the Capitol or really read bills. Because, again, if it was a Democrat on the bill or if it was a Republican on the bill, they were going to vote that way, right? So, and that is a little pessimistic of me to say, but again, though, I know that will get better as these newbies kind of, you know, get into their places and, you know, learn a little bit more about the legislative process and, you know, finding their political selves. Some key observations I wanted to mention. I know, like the Dipper Post or somebody used to always do winners and losers of the session. So I just popped a couple up here. K-12 education had a fabulous year this year. So any of you that represent school districts, hopefully your school boards are going to be quite pleased, and your superintendents, of course. What's known as the budget stabilization factor used to be the negative factor, which is the amount of money that the state is supposed to owe K-12 schools. Got about $180 million more this year, and then that budget stabilization factor is going to be eliminated next fiscal year, so that K-12 schools are going to be fully funded, which is a huge, huge win for K-12. As I mentioned, given the makeup and the huge majorities that the Democrats had, moderation actually prevailed down at the Capitol. We did not see a lot of progressive bills that were being pushed by a lot of advocacy organizations. And I'll point out a couple here when we talk about some specific bills, but really moderation kind of won at the Capitol, even though it's a little bit hard to believe. Some losers, Governor Polis, he suffered his first legislative defeat this year. So his 5th year in office, the legislature finally said, you know, no, we're not going to do this. You know, just don't have the votes to pass your signature piece of legislation, which was his land use bill, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. House Minority Leader Mike Lynch is a wonderful individual. He's from Estes Park, Loveland area, and I think he did a great job as a minority leader. However, he just couldn't handle his caucus. The House Republicans were the most unruly group down at the Capitol. There was about 4 or 5 of them that really, they filibustered quite a bit. They made the House implement certain rules to limit debate on bills, to not have bills read at length, you know, those kind of things. So he just lost control of his caucus. That's the only reason why I put him into the loser category. But I think he was very good at reining in those members who were not, you know, kind of those loose cannons, if you will. So the state budget, I wanted to mention this just briefly, just so you have an idea of where the state's economy is going. This is just a graph of the U.S. economy, but Colorado generally follows this very closely. And you can see we're still on a projected growth path. If you look at the state general fund, which is made up of mostly income tax and a little bit of state sales tax, you can see that the general fund is still increasing. So this was the March expectations, but after the kind of the COVID hit that wasn't as bad as folks thought, the general fund still increased. We're going to see kind of not big growth, 3%, 4% for the next couple of years. This is still very much a K-shaped recovery, though. The COVID pandemic certainly did not harm those higher income earners in the state. But at least it's a good thing to know that the state's budget is still on the up. Some of the highlights of the state budget, as I mentioned, the big increase to K-12 education, about $1,000 per student. Higher education also had an increase. They got about 10% more. The legislature also put in a tuition cap of 5% so that our public institutions of higher education can't raise their tuition more than 5%. A lot of one-time allocations as well, too. We saw a lot of this with the COVID stimulus dollars. The budget committee did more, put in a lot for affordable housing, economic development programs, child care, those kind of services. We're getting a new Black Hawk helicopter to the tune of $26 million. And then the state's general fund reserve is at 15%, which is great. So if there's a flood or a fire or anything like that, then the state has a pretty hefty general fund reserve. So hopefully we can absorb that. Okay. So if we move into some of the legislation, I will say that it was a big year for affordable housing. That seems to be the topic du jour down at the Capitol. How are we going to make Colorado a more affordable place to live? I could say the same thing about providing certain healthcare services, trying to make health insurance more affordable. Those were really kind of the big topics. Industries continue to be targeted, certain industries, I should say, employers, businesses, oil and gas. Those are kind of all, and hospitals are kind of all, certainly targets for legislators to go after. But if we look at some of the major policy bills that wanted to throw out there, there was a big auto theft bill. I don't know if any of you here know that it's not a felony if you steal a car if it's less than $2,000 in value. Criminals figured that one out and actually started stealing cars that are under $2,000 in value, which hurt those people that need those cars probably the most, right? So that bill, it was changed from a felony to a misdemeanor maybe a couple years ago with some law enforcement reforms, and so that was put back into place. And as you can imagine, there was some pushback on creating a new felony. Right? That's also kind of one of those popular things down at the Capitol too, is being careful of criminal justice issues, right? And criminalizing certain behaviors. So that was put into place. Air quality along the I-25 corridor, we're now at a severe non-attainment zone. So air quality in Denver is pretty poor. This bill started out very bold and put in a lot of restrictions that would have restricted certain emissions from dry cleaners, breweries, all kinds of different businesses. But it was eventually pared down to create an interim committee that'll be meeting this interim to look at ways to improve air quality. It does target oil and gas a little bit as it relates to the public being able to complain about oil and gas. But certainly it was dramatically pared down to what it was when it was introduced. Legalizing mushrooms. I don't know how many of you all remember that we passed legalizing legal mushrooms in November at the ballot. So you now can, do mushrooms. I don't know. The one thing about this bill is that so when marijuana became legal in 2014, 2015. It was very much regulated, and there was local control around marijuana, right? So cities and counties could regulate how many stores were in their jurisdictions, if they even wanted to allow stores in their jurisdictions. That's not the same thing with mushrooms. The ballot measure that we voted on in November did not specifically have any kind of local control in it. CML and the counties fought really hard to get it, and they weren't successful simply because it was not in the ballot measure. The legislature and the governor, they were too afraid to go against the will of the voters. So there's no local control in this, so those of you that represent cities, your cities will not be able to regulate where these national health centers, I think is what they're called, where these places can go that are going to sell mushrooms, or where you can go and take mushrooms and sit and do whatever it is that you do when you're on mushrooms. I don't know. Look at lights, I don't know. There were several gun bills, like gun safety reform package, all but one, the assault weapons ban passed, or the assault weapons ban did not pass. The other bills, increasing the age to possess a firearm, having gun manufacturers held liable, those kind of things, increasing the red flag alerts, those bills did pass. A lot of that was, initiated from some of the shootings that we've had in the state. Public employee protections, and I'm curious how this is going to affect local governments, and I don't know if it's going to affect risk managers, but this is kind of a collective bargaining 2.0 type of bill, because we did see collective bargaining for counties last legislative session, the 2022 session. It was thought that during this session that cities were going to be next, but that bill was not introduced, and instead this one came. It basically just prohibits a local government from discriminating against an employee when that employee is participating in certain political events or political functions or whatever it is that that employee is doing, or like labor relation type of activities, right? So this one will be, it's gone into effect. The governor did sign it. I know CML and some others were hoping that this was going to be one of the governor's vetoes. And I should mention, now that I'm talking about the governor, he had until June 7th, so it was that last Wednesday, to either sign or veto bills. And so we have passed that deadline, so all the bills that he was planning on signing, he's signed. I think he vetoed about 4 or 5 bills. But he did not veto this one, so I imagine your cities and counties, school districts were included in this as well too, and are going to be figuring out how to implement this one. So something to take note of. 3 bills that did not pass. These were part of the progressive agenda. So there was a bill that would have allowed local governments to put in place rent control. It wouldn't have put rent control in place, but it just would have allowed, cities like Lakewood or Thornton or Colorado Springs to put rent control in place. That bill died over in the Senate. There was a bill that would have placed restrictions on employers, mainly those employers in the retail and restaurant industries, that would have required them to post work schedules 2 weeks in advance, do retainage pay, make sure that older employees were provided more shifts than newer employees, those kind of things. So a lot of, again, regulations on employers. That bill didn't make it out of its first committee. And then there's another bill that died in the Senate that would have allowed local governments to open up substance abuse centers or overdose prevention centers to where it kind of like a safe injection site. That bill did not make it out of the Senate. I imagine that one might have been a big deal for risk managers, right? So that one did not make it. You can tell local governments involved and businesses involved in all 3 of these bills, right? Employers. So, but those were all introduced by progressive members of the House. They were all House bills. Most of the progressive members were all in the House. No, I shouldn't say most. All of the progressive members are members of the House. Okay, some of the big bills that I just want to mention, I don't know if you have an interest in them or not, but these were kind of the big ones that gathered a lot of attention. This was the governor's land use bill, right? So basically what it would have done is that it would have taken away the control of zoning and planning from local governments and instead given it to the state. DOLA would have had that authority and would have mandated that cities and counties allow upzoning being knocking down single-family homes and putting up duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. So all of a sudden you could have, if you had a 6-plex, family of 4, you could have 24 new neighbors right next to you. It would have allowed, or I shouldn't say allowed, but would have required cities to allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, create certain housing complexes, around transit, those kind of things. So, and it would have restricted single-family homes. So you would have said bye to single-family homes, which, I don't know, that's kind of part of the American dream, isn't it? The single-family home with a white picket fence, right? And there were a lot of parking restrictions in this too. But really the idea here that the governor was pitching, a very progressive idea that I think somewhere in a city in California has tried it, maybe one in Michigan as well too, is to increase density so that you limit urban sprawl. And so you don't have as much of an impact on the environment. You cut down on vehicles, those kind of things. So some of the environmental folks got on board with this bill. And then also the main idea around this is that you increase supply, so then the prices go down, right, of housing. How long that takes to actually go into effect, with that market, yeah, it would take years, right? So the bill was eventually stripped down in the Senate. So it started out in the Senate. It was stripped down to basically a needs assessment study, and we said okay to the ADUs. That was fine. Once it got to the House put back in everything else that the governor wanted that was in the original bill, which caused a heck of a storm down at the Capitol. Everybody was up in arms. There were over 500 people that testified on this bill. I mean, this guy was big. I imagine all of your cities were probably involved in this one. Ultimately, when that bill, when it was amended back in the House, when it went back over to the Senate for concurrence, the Senate said no, basically. They said, no, we're not going to accept your version. We need to negotiate. We need to figure this out. So the House, the Senate, the governor's office got together, and they could not find a compromise. So on the very last day of the legislative session, the bill died on the calendar. It was not brought up for a vote. So huge win for a lot of local governments. This was huge. And again, the governor's only legislative defeat so far in his 5 years as governor. So big win for local government. So when you see your city councilors and mayors, you can give them a little pat on the back for that one. So, oh yeah, there's my big X. So no, that one did not make it. Two other bills I want to mention, and these will probably be of personal interest to you, but so property taxes, right? How many of you all got your notice of valuation in May? And how many of you have a higher assessed value on your house? Yeah. Anywhere in the state, I think the lowest is 15% increase, the highest is 82. That's Routt County. So if any of you own a house or a condo in Steamboat, you guys are sitting pretty, right? When you go to sell, maybe not when you pay your property tax, but when you go to sell, you should be doing just fine. So with these big increases in assessed value, your property taxes are going to go up, right? Even though Colorado has some of the lowest property taxes in the state. The assessment rate is 6.95, something like that. So that's essentially you're paying 6.95%. You're paying tax on 6.95% of your house. So it's very low, but still, right? For those that are on fixed incomes or that have a huge increase, that's going to be a hit. So the legislature introduced 303 very late in the legislative session. It's essentially going to lower assessment rates for both residential and non-residential, so homes and commercial buildings. Very small percentage, like point something, really is what it's going to be. But that will have some sort of impact. It does ask the state, I don't know if any of you are familiar with what's known as debrucing, which is part of Tabor. So Tabor does two things in the state. It says that any tax increase has to go to the vote of the people, so we have to say yes. But it also caps the growth that the state can have, population plus inflation. And oftentimes we hit that cap, and when we do hit that cap, you all, as a taxpayer, will get a refund. And that refund is usually in your tax return, but there's a new way that it's coming to you. Basically, what this is going to do is going to ask you all to let the state keep that money instead. So that's going to be part of this. The senior homestead exemption becomes portable right now. If you are in your home and you're of a certain age, you get a property tax exemption. You have to be in that house for 10 years though. But you can now move within that 10 year and you still get that tax exemption. I don't think any of you are of that age though. You all look very young and spry. The other thing about this as well is that it does require the vote of the people, so Prop HH. So none of this, even though the only thing that does require a vote of the people is to debruce, you all have to vote yes on this. Have any of you seen this in the news recently or heard about this property tax measure that's coming on the ballot?
Hasn't there been a lawsuit filed against it?
Yep. Just a couple days ago, that lawsuit, the judge said that it can move forward. That was a lot of folks that don't agree with this were hoping that the judge would strike it down based off the single subject rule. There's a lot in this, right? You would think that this would violate the single subject rule that we have in Colorado, but it didn't.
Like that senior homestead exemption seems like it should stand on its own.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Because there are states that have that, and that's actually really good, because
Uh-huh.
if you're about to retire and you need to downsize,
Yes.
you buy a lesser home and you pay 3 times the amount of taxes, but if you're, if you're able to like transfer your old property tax, I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah. That has been a bill on its own for the past 7 years now at the Capitol.
Yeah.
Always sponsored by Republicans, and it never makes it across the finish line.
Mm.
But yet it did with the Democratic bill.
Huh.
Yeah. Now, you can also think of, when you're going to vote on this as well too, lower assessment, lower property taxes means that cities and counties, not really cities, some cities, you all have a little bit of property tax, but counties and school districts are going to get a lot less money. Yeah. That's the bad thing with this, right? However, it is going to help backfill this bill or this ballot measure, it's both, will help backfill the loss that counties and school districts will lose up to a certain percentage, right? It's not full replacement, but it's up to a certain percentage. That backfill is coming from your Tabor refund. Do any of you remember that $700 check you got last September, right before the election? Right? You got a check. Yeah. So that was your Tabor refund. And last year, and this year as well too, is going to be the next bill I talk about, the legislature and the governor decided that your Tabor refund, instead of you getting it on your tax return, which I guarantee none of you know when you get your Tabor refund on your tax return, right? It's hidden, it's buried. It's nowhere on your tax return form anywhere. But you got the check, and so you know that you got your Tabor refund because you got a check. Now, we are in a Tabor refund situation again this year, this fiscal year, because we brought in more than inflation plus population. So instead of getting that check, your Tabor refund check is going to go to backfill this.
Is it all the money or is it capped at a certain amount?
For the Tabor refund?
Yeah.
It's capped at a certain amount, and I'll tell you why in just a sec. So this is kind of a bait and switch, right? You're getting a lower property tax, but yet you're not getting your Tabor refund.
Yeah, you're paying for it either way.
Yeah, you're paying for it either way,
Well,
right?
also, if people that rent, aren't they gonna lose their Tabor refund?
Yes, yep.
To pay their landlord's
And that's the
property taxes?
yep, and that's the reason why the next bill came.
Oh,
So yes,
okay.
hold that thought, Jeff. So,
Good analysis.
yeah, you're doing good. So, this was so contentious at the end of session that this is what caused the Republicans to walk out on the last day of the session. So here they are, kind of walking in the middle, heading out. That's Minority Leader Mike Lynch. He led them all to walk out, and then here they are outside giving a press conference, right, talking about how unfair this measure is, how they wouldn't let any Republicans amend this so that Republicans could also help take credit for this, et cetera, everything political, right? So this is really what kind of boiled over everything at the Capitol at the last day. I just so happened to be there. It was so interesting to watch. I had never seen it before, right? But so and again, the House being the more contentious chamber this year, and they had such strong, a lot of the Republicans had very strong opinions and political affiliations, et cetera. And so it just, I don't know, it was very interesting to see. And rightfully so, they weren't able to amend the bill. So I'd probably get a little upset too, right? So, as Jeff pointed out, and as was mentioned, since this does use some of your Tabor refund, it wouldn't use all of it. There was another bill that was introduced on day 118. There's 120 days of the legislative session. It takes 3 days to pass a bill. That's quite speedy if you think about it, to actually debate a bill in both chambers, right? So this bill was introduced just in the nick of time. So the Democrats decided that, renters aren't benefiting from this property tax bill, and maybe we should do something else for taxpayers as well too. Let's give them another Tabor refund. So this bill, you're also going to vote on this at the ballot, whether or not you should get your Tabor refund back. So it's going to be equalized. so that, you know, there were some individuals that got the $750 check, there were some that didn't. So this one is going to give back or give you a check regardless of how much income tax you pay. So single filers will pay or get 600 or so back. Dual income filers will get double that, right? But also you have to vote on this to pass. This has to pass in order for the other one to pass too. That's the other tricky bait and switch as well. So you're being tempted by a check to vote for this so that you also get your property tax reduction too. It's also coming out of your Tabor refund. What? I'm sure I've confused some of you. I'm even kind of confused now myself. Anyway, so that's your Tabor. And here are the Tabor projections that we have for the next couple of fiscal years. And you can see it's declining. It's not a stable form of revenue. So if Proposition 303 does pass with the reduction in property taxes, which is 10 years, how is the state going to backfill all of that when the Tabor refunds are declining? It's then going to come out of the state's general fund, which is going to hit K-12 education, higher education, healthcare, the the corrections department, our jails. So it could very well just be a fiscal mess again. So something to consider when you're at the ballot box in November, when you're voting on these two things, just to keep in mind, right? Okay.
Quick question on that.
Yes.
On the local government, what's the percentage that they're going to get back?
Right. There's some sort of formula. It depends on your population and what you were projected to, what your increase was projected to be. I think they're saying that no county can have more than, I should say county and school district, can have more than 20% of a revenue increase. So that Route County that had like an 82% increase in assessed values, they're probably going to be hurting a little bit. They'll still get the 20%, but they probably could have gotten a lot more.
So on top of everything, then you're going to have your state programs that are going to take potentially a hit and not have growth in those environments.
Yeah. Okay, on that positive note. So if we talk about some legislation of interest, and I know there's a lot on this slide here, but I popped it up because I assumed you all might want to know some of these specifics. But so this was House Bill 1076 was the annual negotiations bill, the annual work comp negotiations bill that the self-insureds, Pinnacle, and WCEA engage in every year. So there was about 9 or so different changes that came out this year. They started the negotiations pretty early this year, last year, like in October, November, December. And it was finalized pretty early in the legislative session. It's got one of the early numbers, 1076. You can see some of the things the bill did. The most impactful thing that the bill did is right here, the top one, expanding mental impairment coverage from 12 to 36 weeks. That essentially, I think, is going to have the most impact for self-insureds, right? There's a couple of other things as it relates to replacing prosthetics and eyeglasses. It increased attorney fees, WCA attorney fees, 20 to 25%. That was contentious as that was going through. But some other kind of technical details as well, too. And I imagine there's some sort of summary that we can send out, that the self-insureds have, that we can send to PRIMA if that's needed. But the bill did not pass towards the end of the legislative session, and I'm including some of the votes in these bills just so you can kind of see. It's just kind of interesting that with these numbers, it was basically partisan, right? It didn't have to be. The negotiations bill was never usually partisan and almost passed unanimously very easily. But for a couple of reasons. One was because there was a little bit of bad faith negotiating by WCEA. That it did turn into a little bit of a partisan type issue. And there actually were some people that were a little bit upset about that attorney fee increase. So that was the negotiations bill. 2 other bills came out on work comp. It seems that, the past couple of years, right, for those of you who follow work comp legislation, it seems that it's become a sexy topic, right? It's kind of low-hanging fruit for, and I think mainly for workers for labor organizations, right? So they've been going after it a little bit. This one was a little bit interesting, 1196. This bill basically says that if a company or a business employer, whatever, if they have employed a minor and they are intentionally requiring that minor to work outside of normal hours, and if they're also engaged in some sort of work that's prohibited by the Remedies at Law Act, the Colorado Youth Act, that employer should be held liable, and that the employee should be able to get work comp benefits and also have some sort of legal remedy. They can file a tort or something like that as well. So this one we were able to successfully amend it to where you cannot double dip for this one. But this one had some pretty strong testimony in committee, and it was also very hard to argue against, not punishing an employer for having a minor do something they're not supposed to do, right? And so the argument was basically, well, employer, don't violate the law. If you do violate the law, here are these remedies. You can tell that one was also a partisan vote as well. And then hopefully, I imagine you all are familiar with perhaps the CAPS bill. This was a bill that was going to be introduced in the House that would have removed the caps, the upper and the lower caps on benefits, as well as changed the impairment schedule when you go and pay claims. There's certain schedule ratings, right, for certain injuries. So this bill would have dramatically altered that. Gosh, I can't. This sucker was a piece of work, right? This bill was essentially the bill that caused a lot of very hard feelings down at the Capitol. WCEA brought this bill along with AFL outside of the negotiating table. This was one of those bills that was brought forward in the negotiations. We said no to it. Pinnacle said no to it. And we had an agreement that no other work comp legislation was going to be introduced from that negotiation list. And lo and behold, this bill came out, a month later? Maybe not even a month.
No.
Yeah. Came out later, and everybody, I think everybody was just gobsmacked. Like what? How? What? I thought we had agreed that we weren't going to do anything else work comp related. Thankfully, the bill was not introduced. And I will say there were a lot of stakeholder meetings with the House sponsor, who was from Larimer County, Fort Collins. There were a lot of conversations with him. A lot of you all in here, I imagine, might have been involved in gathering data, crunching numbers, to see what the impact of this bill would have been. I think our average was 4 times the impact that self-insured members would have had. I know there was also a big impact for private insurance carriers as well too, and businesses. So this was a huge victory to not get this bill introduced. We did, I can't tell you how many stakeholder meetings there were, how many side conversations that were had. We even had a conversation with the Speaker's office and said, you don't want to do this. This is going to cause, pardon my language, a shitstorm amongst the business community, right? You don't want to do this. And we used a lot of data and numbers that came from the self-insured entities. And I know a lot of you in this room are familiar with crunching those numbers, so thank you for that. This one could come back in some form or fashion next year. So just beyond notice that this one might come back. A couple of others that just to point out as well, some business-related bills. As I mentioned, a lot of those national kind of issues that play out as it relates to employment issues always trickle down to the state. The POWER Act, which was Senate Bill 172, which basically kind of amends the definition of harassment and discrimination. It tightens it up so that it's more clear and so that employees have a better opportunity to bring a discrimination or harassment claim against an employer. That finally passed. I think this was the 3rd year that it was introduced, and it did finally pass. You can see it was pretty partisan as well too. There were actually some Democrats in the House that did not vote for it. But this was, this is going to have have an impact on all employers. That's why I have it up here, not just private employers, public employers as well too. Same with equal pay for equal work. As you can imagine, this one was popular as well, had been introduced for years as well too. And then, as Jeff mentioned, the bathroom bill, the toilet bill, what are you calling it, Jeff?
Toilet bill.
Toilet bill. So amenities for all genders in public restrooms. So any public building or that's owned by a public entity or operated by a public entity that is a new building or that is going through a renovation has to include a multi-gender bathroom. It also has to include signage for baby changing stations, and every bathroom a bathroom that's on every floor of that public building has to have a baby changing station as well too, and for both genders, and male and female. And then the non-gendered bathroom, it either has to be a single stall, so it's a single restroom, or if that restroom has multiple stalls, those stalls have to be able to accommodate either gender in that bathroom. This one was a hard one to oppose, but CML and CCI, I think more so CML, did work to try to cut down the impact. The legislative sponsors were very much dedicated to seeing this bill pass. There was talk of limiting the scope so that for a renovation, that renovation had to be substantial, or it had to be of a certain amount, or that you were actually changing pipes and relocating certain things and not just, maybe putting up new tile or something. But if you're going to have a really substantial renovation, then okay, yes, we can make sure that it will accommodate genders. But they basically didn't want to do that. So this bill ended up passing as is, and yeah, it's going to cost money. It's an unfunded mandate to local governments, right? Now, for those like North Glen, I know is building a new town hall or city hall. They didn't have too much of an issue with this one simply because they're building now, they can accommodate it, right? But for those that have older city halls or courthouses or schools or whatever that may be, those entities are going to be the ones that are going to be most impacted because of the cost, right?
And for those risk managers that have ADA compliance responsibility, this is going to affect your program as well. I know I'm looking at it at Larimer County. I've got 20 bathrooms to update in the next couple of years, and I don't know if we're going to have enough money to do that because of this bill.
We're doing that right now, so our Thornton City Hall, first floor bathrooms are being planned to be renovated with $88 because they're not ADA compliant today. So we've got the numbers, crunched the numbers, and then we're good to go for next year. And then this bill came about.
Right.
And the problem that we have with this bill is that it requires every floor. That's just the first floor, but every floor at City Hall now has to have gender neutral bathrooms.
Right.
And for us to do that effectively, it's going to cost a lot more money. So money we don't have. So guess what? We're scrapping the first floor ADA project, which is unfair because that project really needs to happen. But because of this, the cost is now just too much.
Right.
So if you're gonna do one of them, all you have to do is subject to it? Is that-
Yeah.
Yes, if you do one renovation, now it doesn't even have $10,000 or more.
Right,
If
yeah.
you do a renovation, then every floor
Then
has
it's
to have
every-
gender neutral restrooms.
Does it mean you have to add a gender neutral bathroom, or you just have to convert all your bathrooms to gender neutral?
Either or.
You can do either one.
Yeah, you can do either one. Yeah. Yeah, because I don't know if it's easier to do single stalls.
Red Rock, I just say that last time we went to Red Rocks, they had like gender neutral at the bottom, and they
Okay.
just had stalls that went all the way to the ceiling and the floor,
Yeah.
and that's.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think that's what you would do.
Do they have anything for like, if you already have something in place, that you're like already have all your,
I'm sure, yes.
If,
I would
if you've already got it planned, budgeted, and designed, you're okay.
Yeah.
But if it's not, then
Yeah.
this bill.
I'd have to look to see when this bill takes effect, if it has an implementation date, and whether or not they gave local governments an extended time frame to do
I believe
that.
it was 30 days after the close of session. was when
Yeah,
it took effect.
that's normally when they go into effect unless it specifies a different date. So that would be,
I thought it was January 1st.
And there, well, there's multiple
Okay.
dates in the bill.
there are. I thought there was something on 2026, but that's probably not one.
There's something out there in 2026.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that I don't quite remember, but, yeah. Speaking of ADA, there's also going to be an interim committee on ADA, on disability issues, on having public buildings accessible. So that is going to be something next probably on your all's plate, watching that, speaking of ADA compliant and such. Okay, I think those were all the pieces of legislation. Real quick, because I don't know where I am on time, hopefully I'm not gabbing a whole bunch. Oh yeah, as I mentioned, there'll be interim committees. These are kind of the major ones, and accessibility should also be on there. So there's going to be a big interim committee studying child welfare, studying air quality, school finance, of course, and accessibility is on there as well too, in addition to some standard interim committees that the legislature looks at anyway, right? The election, so I'm going to pop the same ones up. So we do know the property tax is Proposition HH. We don't know what the Tabor refund one is going to be yet. That has to be cycled through the Secretary of State, so we'll get a number on that one. But there's also going to be other things on the ballot. Since it is 2023, it's an off election year, an odd number election year, there's only revenue questions on the ballot, right? So 2024, you're going to see a lot more. That's when all kinds of things go on the ballot, right? Is the even number of years, but odd number of years, it's just fiscal issues. So I want to also bring to your attention that there will likely be other ballot measures aimed at reducing your property tax, rather than just Prop HH. Some of those are very troubling, so just read up on what you're voting on is all I can say, right? And also watch what you sign at Supers or Safeway or whatever. Right? Just be very cautious of it, because some of these things, like, you know, for example, there's one that only allows a 3% increase on your home value. That sounds great, but think about those implications in the future for that. That's exactly what happened in California. Prop 8 or something in California, and that, I mean, that has caused all kinds of issues in California. There will likely be a reduction in the state income tax on the ballot as well, too, which I think we approved it this past year as well. Our state income tax has now gone down as well. Anyway, so we'll see that. And then just a couple of things to note moving forward. The future of work comp negotiations, after I mentioned what happened last year with the CAPS bill, I don't know if there's going to be any negotiations moving forward. I know there's certainly salt in the wound and a very bad taste in folks' mouths, certainly mine as well, on the CAPS bill and what's going to happen with that. Also, so as I mentioned, with moderation being a winner this legislative session, given the majorities the Democrats had, and I'd say this if the Republicans were in the majority as well too, a lot of the moderates are turned out in 2024, right? So next session, there's not an election between now and next session, so we're still going to have the same legislative makeup, and we still have a lot of the moderates that are in the legislature currently, but a lot of them are going to be turned out after 2024. So likely we'll see progressives, perhaps, more progressives, come into the legislature. So what's going to happen with that as it relates to the legislation that we see moving forward, right? I can tell you there'll be a lot more unfunded mandates, a lot more requirements, restrictions, et cetera. That seems to be a common theme with a lot of the Democratic majority these days. Okay, I think that was all that I had for you. Happy to answer questions or sit down and be quiet. And hand it off to the other castle.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was very informative. Appreciate it.
Talk about kind of a historical market overview, kind of show you historical what we've seen in the marketplace. We're going to talk about where we've been more recently. Then we're going to talk about the current state of the market and then kind of where we're headed. So it's kind of a little bit of doom and gloom. We've got some positive things here. And we really are going to focus on, in the beginning we're going to talk about the whole market holistically, but we're going to spend most of our time focusing on property, casualty, and cyber, because those are really the three key lines that are moving the market right now. Let's go to the next slide. So moving on to just a historical market overview. I don't know how easy this is to see, but this is the the insurance cycle, circle or disc, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not going to go through all the different steps in the cycle, but the left half side of the cycle is the harder market. The right-hand side is the softening market. I'd make the argument that if you looked at property, we're probably sitting somewhere in here. Market capacity's eroded. Rates are strongly rising somewhere in there. Casualties in the same place. But if you talked about cyber, we're probably over here right now, which might be a surprise to some people, maybe not. But we're starting to see the market soften. We're starting to see things change. So that's a positive. So on a macro level, that's the cycle. Here is the historical market cycle from a premium change perspective, issued by the CIAB, going all the way back to 1999 through the second quarter of 2022. So if you look at the spikes in this chart, you can see the market was starting to harden. Then 9/11 hit, and we had a huge spike back in the 2002 period from a premium perspective. Then we had a pretty sustained downward softening market as rates came down. Then we had the financial crisis, the housing crisis back around 2008, which brought the market back up again. We had some tapering. Then we started to see the market firm up a little bit as we rolled into COVID, and as COVID happened, it got firmer. So now what you're seeing is that really from about 2018 forward, we've been in about a 5-year sustained hard market that's defined by aggregate premiums year over year being higher, right, in total. So that's kind of where we're at right now. This is a snapshot, kind of showing you the same data, but breaking out by casualty coverages on the top and by property on the bottom. The thing I would point out here, which I think is interesting, is just obviously you can see the cycle from 18 where we're up on both sides, but where we were in a soft market here on the casualty and the property, you'll see it's a little bit more pronounced on the property side where the market was quite a bit softer than the casualty, where a lot of premiums were reduced over that period of time, which I think in the scheme of things has created some catch-up as we kind of move forward with the property market. So where have we been? So this is Gallagher data going back to, by quarter, going back to 2019, and it's showing median change in premium / rate by line of coverage. So if you look at this chart here, a lot of the lines of coverage have been hovering in that 0 to 10% increase range since Q4 of 2019. The two outliers are really cyber, which is the orange bar, or I don't know if that's, maybe that's red, but it's going way up. You can see it peaking there around 2021. Pretty significant 50% increase. And then you're going to see the D&O on the bottom there, which isn't as applicable to our lines of coverage because it's a public company. But the other thing of note is, again, this is Q1 of 2023. We're seeing an uptick right here, this green line in property, and that's an early indicator because things have really kind of gotten hot since then. So that's kind of what we're seeing in the marketplace. The thing about this data here, this is reflective of Gallagher's book of business across the country, so it's not just public sector. When we look at public sector data here in a second, it's a little bit more pronounced in certain areas, but this is just to kind of give you a good snapshot of what we're seeing across the marketplace. So what this is telling us is of the top 10 natural catastrophes that we've had that have been, what's the valuation here? I guess no, just the top 10 natural catastrophes we've ever had in the United States. 6 of those have happened in the last 6 years. And that's property. So you think about that. 6 of the worst events ever in the history have been in the last 6 years. So you think about the impact that has on our property insurance market and their cat losses. So it's having an impact on our reinsurance market, right? So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. The next slide. This is just a quick snapshot just to give you an idea of who our top 10 trading partners are for public sector. In this particular chart, it's a lot of usual suspects that I'm sure a lot of you work with. I think it's pronounced, though, to notice that how much Lloyd's is such a big player right now in the marketplace for public sector. So, they're a kind of a market of last resort for tougher risks, and we're placing a lot of business with Lloyd's these days. The next chart is higher ed. I don't think we have anybody in here that's higher ed. But for higher ed, Lloyd's is second, and then we work with United Educators, we're their largest trading partner, so that's no surprise. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at with what we've seen with the property market. So this is just rate changes quarter over quarter for property for our entire public sector book of business. So what I wanted to point out here is this is This is the median rate increase, and this is the 75th percentile. So we've got 13.3%, so almost 40% rate change that we saw in Q1 of 2023. And again, keep in mind, this is for all public sector. If we go to the next slide. So now we're going to break it out. We've got single layered property programs, which means we have a monoline property carrier that is writing all the property coverage. Those are getting fewer and far between as far as finding markets that have the capacity and ability to do that. The list is, FM Global, Travelers, Zurich a little bit, AIG is not as much anymore, but it's a small marketplace. So this here is showing us what we're seeing in that single layered program. So increases ranging from 12 to 36% on average for our public sector book of business. Now going to the next slide, from 12 to 36, now we go from 25 to 52% in the shared and layered property market. So this is where, there aren't a lot of single carrier markets. So this is getting multiple carriers to build out a tower of property coverage. It's more expensive. We're in the E&S marketplace. There's frictional cost. There's a lot of challenges associated with that market right now, and that market, that E&S market, is overwhelmed. So if you are placed in a single carrier market and can stay there, do it. That's the place to be. It's not always easy. We were fortunate in moving a client this year to AFM, which is one affiliated Factor Mutual, one of the AFM companies, and everyone in this room. But it's a process. It takes, what did it take, 10 months to go through all the engineering? 9 or 10 months. You've got it. It's FM is an engineering company. They're going to come out. They're going to engineer the crap out of all your key structures. It's not an easy process, but if you can get with a carrier like that, it's a benefit to you, especially in this marketplace right now. This is a quick snapshot of what we saw in 2022 from a natural catastrophe perspective. We had $18 billion plus losses in 2022 from natural catastrophes. So again, putting that into perspective, that is hitting reinsurance treaties. These are cat losses. It's tough for the reinsurance marketplace. And then this is just an interesting chart I thought I would show. This just shows in 5-year tranches excess of $10 billion weather-related events. And if you were to take a straight line average here, kind of from 1993 to 98 up, what you would see is that those events are doubling about every 5 years. So values are going up, the frequency of these claims are going up. So it's really, again, having an impact on the catastrophic property marketplace.
And they get into the historical for casualty. So really this is representing our general liability, and again it's the same idea with the graphs, the median and the 75th percentile. One thing I'll note here is the volatility in the middle, and really that's showing our pricing volatility. And really, if we move on here, so now this is umbrella, and you see that volatility again, and it's starting to subside a little bit towards the end. But really it's a frequency and severity issue with general liability. And then moving into some liability laws, obviously we're all aware of these. 217, you no longer have to file claims in federal court to avoid the caps you can do in Colorado. The Claire Davis School Act it's a limited waiver of governmental immunity for schools, and then the removal of the statute of limitations for any incidents after 2022. And really, I called some underwriters, and we wanted to see how Colorado stacks up and how we rank against the rest of the U.S. and how they view our risk. And the feedback wasn't good. I won't name one of them, but one of them said they wouldn't touch us with a 10-foot pole. Another one, we spoke to Old Re. Old Re said they really throw us into 2 different categories: law enforcement liability and all other casualty. And Old Re said they're not writing any more new law enforcement liability business. But on the flip side, all other casualty, it's a favorable line for them. So, and then Genesis. Genesis kind of mirrored the same thoughts. One thing I will note, Genesis had a comment. They said, "You're no California, but you're up there." And so,
Can I ask a question? So based on the law that passed, I can definitely see that. But are
Is anyone seeing a huge increase in the actual lawsuits that are filed post 217 to justify that concern? And maybe my hope is that in 10 years, we'll see that still a very concerning law in Colorado is going to be hotter than other states, but maybe it won't be the we'll never touch you with a 10-foot pole type of situation.
Can we get there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Stay tuned.
And so this chart here, this is really showing, this chart, it's showing the top 50, the median of the top 50 US claims by year, and then the frequency. And so really it touches on social inflation. And social inflation is the societal trends that are influencing claims costs really above the overall average. And here we can see, outsized jury awards, that's what's causing. It's causing, legal proceedings are taking longer, and then it's eroding statutory immunity. And I would also throw in there nuclear verdicts as well. And so if we look at this, obviously the COVID year, courts were down, we'll take that year out. But if we look here, 2022 expected is about to be higher than we've ever seen. And that's your median of the top 50 costs. And then also, as the frequency starts to creep back, we're starting to see a lot of that social inflation take place and reflect itself in claims costs. And then third-party litigation also rolls right into social inflation. Third-party litigation is exactly what it sounds like. Third parties are coming in and they're financing these claims. And really what it's doing is it's allowing the proceedings to go longer and allowing them to ask for higher settlements. And it says the industry was valued at $11 billion in 2020. In 2025, it's supposedly valued at $18 billion. Now, after we put this together, Swiss Re came out with some updated numbers. Currently, today, it's valued at $17 billion industry. And then by 2028, it's supposed to be a $30 billion industry. So it's not going away. And then with auto. So auto, it's been consistent price increases is what we've seen with auto. There hasn't been major increases, but we've definitely seen some. And then cyber, everybody's favorite subject. So with cyber, we can see here the peak was back in Q4, 2021, and that was really when the peak of these price increases came. And this came much earlier than a lot of other industries for public sector, because public sector is one of the first industries to get hit hard with a lot of cyber claims. And really looking at cyber, the pricing is down. As we get closer to the current, pricing has started to come down, and the industry has started to stabilize as we've started to get controls in place and really get a grasp on the cyber risk management industry. And so here, this graph, that blue line, just shows the number of ransomware breaches across time here from, 2019 to 2022. That peak right there, that's the peak of COVID. So that's when everyone was sent home. We're trying to figure out work from home. The cyber industry is still relatively fresh, and we don't know what to think of it. And then after that, we start implementing controls, and we start to get those breaches down. And then here, I want to focus on the red box, just because we're seeing that there's a minimum set of controls we need in place with cyber to be able to get coverage, or to get coverage without sublimits or exclusions. And so, really, when we look at this, we're looking at MFA for employee email, remote access, privilege accounts. We're looking at air gap backups, employee training, whether that's phishing training, things of that nature, endpoint detection and response. All these are key elements that underwriters are now expecting when you go and you apply for cyber coverage. And then work comp. So workers' comp has been one of the most stable lines for us for several years now. And I would say Colorado more falls in line with the median, less with the 75th percentile. So we've had good success with work comp. One thing that's interesting to note, if you look at this red one, you see kind of a downwards trend. And that comes from, work from home, right? Over this time, we're doing more and more work from home, and it's driving down those comp costs.
Okay. Now we're talking about the state of the current market, which is exciting stuff. So this is just a chart that just shows the profitability of the P&C industry going back to 1990. And if you look at those blue bars, those represent underwriting profit and loss. So if you look back in the 90s through the mid-2000s, the industry pretty much operated at an underwriting loss. And then as you look forward, you'll see the blue bars once in a while moving up into the red, which reflects a profit. So what was different back here than today is that carriers were writing to an underwriting loss, but they had significant investment income because interest rates were significantly higher. So it was a different underwriting market back then. I was an underwriter back then. I know on our large accounts, we'd write them to an 85% loss ratio because we knew we could make up the difference with investment income. That all changed as interest rates started to go down. And so that's put a lot of pressure on the marketplace. So in 2017, we had a tough cat year. And then underwriters really focused on re-underwriting their books of business, getting rate increases, and getting to underwriting profitability. And as you will see, the last 3, almost 4 years, they've been able to turn a little bit of a profit. So that's been a trend that we've been seeing. So they've been doing it through underwriting, they've been doing it through rate, they've been doing it through terms and conditions. So that's kind of been the most recent trend. If you go to the next slide, very similar for the London market. The combined ratio, which anything under 100% means that you're making money. For London in 2000 was 97, it was 93.5% in 21, and around 92% in 22. So from an underwriting perspective, things are looking better from a primary carrier perspective. If you go to the next slide. And then the last piece from a London perspective is they've seen a big reduction in what they call their attritional losses, which are their casualty and property losses that are non-cat, non-nuclear verdict, that type of stuff. But what they've seen a big spike in is in the major loss ratio, which is those cat losses driven by property and large casualty claims. So we're kind of seeing a real change in the marketplace, in the London marketplace. The next slide kind of gives us a different perspective. So the primary carriers are re-underwriting their books, they're doing better, but we just talked about what's happening with natural cats across the country, the frequency, the severity. We're seeing these larger nuclear verdicts. So what has happened from 21 to 22 is the reinsurance market has taken it in the shorts, paying out claims. And the capital that's been available is shrunk significantly. If you look at the bar chart from 21 to 22, a substantial reduction in capital in the reinsurance market, which we refer to as capacity. It's ability to put up limits for primary carriers because they reach out to the secondary reinsurance market to get reinsurance. They can put up higher limits. So that's creating a real challenge, as well as solvency ratios on the reinsurance side have really taken a tip downwards. So what this tells us, and this is the worst we've seen since 2008 of the financial crisis, where we saw a surplus dip of this magnitude. So we are in a severe hard market for reinsurance. So that's I think everybody in this room is probably experiencing that if you've gone through the renewal process on some of your accounts, but that's what we're seeing. Then this is just another example of capital that came into the market after a big cat event, and the 3 biggest, 9/11, Katrina, and Ian. And as you can see here, the capital that's come in after the Ian event is significantly less than we've seen in prior large natural events. And really what's driving this is, and I think I've been in London 3 times last year having underwriting meetings and just listening to underwriters. It's just the capital is not coming in because you look at the historical experience over the last 5 years, and now we've got higher interest rates. You can get a risk-free rate that's more guaranteed. So a lot of capital is going elsewhere. It's leaving our marketplace. So capacity is king right now, without a doubt. So where we're headed. So on the property, just some takeaways here. We're seeing a significant dislocation in the reinsurance market. So it's impacting pricing, it's impacting capacity. We've got a client that last year had a $150 million loss limit. This year, the incumbent market, it was RSUI, quoted $10 million. And what we did, what we found out was that they've been buying facultative reinsurance, going out to the marketplace and buying reinsurance to go from 10 to 150. This year they couldn't even get it. It wasn't even available in the marketplace. So that means we're stacking on other carriers, and it just creating a lot of cost. It's going to continue. Insurance to value is the number one hot topic. It has been for several years now, 2 or 3 years. That are your properties adequately valued at replacement cost? And if you're not, you're going to be penalized. They're going to either add an inflation factor. They might not even quote it, some of the underwriters, just because they've got so many submissions. They want good quality statements of values and property schedules. So that's a really, really important metric in the underwriting process right now.
Sort of like co-insurance and stuff.
So we'll talk about that. We're starting to see, in some cases, margin clauses where, before we've had just loss limits, and say it's a $100 million loss limit, we're going to pay the claim for some of that. In some cases, they're not comfortable with your schedule. They'll say we're putting a 125% margin clause on, or 110%, which means we're not going to pay more than 10 or whatever, 10% of what you have scheduled. So that's a new change. Go back for 1 second. Let's make sure there's anything I missed. The other thing I just wanted to mention is the other thing that's become really prevalent in the property market is the secondary perils. So, underwriters used to model, they've always modeled for earthquake and, named storm down in the south and flood. Now we've got convective storm, wind, hail, especially in Colorado. We're a cat market for that. We have wildfire, which is a cat exposure in Colorado. And the third thing now that's happening, and more so in Texas, was the storm Uri, where we had that huge freeze. Those are 3 types of perils that, historically speaking, underwriters did not model and have given them huge losses in their book of business. So that's a new focus that we're seeing there as well. So then the last thing I would just mention is we're starting to see more discussion about creating captive insurance vehicles in the public sector market. Historically speaking, that was never a conversation because captives were an opportunity to it was a tax play, right? And public entities don't have a tax liability, so it didn't really make a lot of sense. But what we're finding is it's giving clients access to treaty reinsurance markets and additional capital or other capital that's out there that they historically haven't had access to because we need to tap into all those different sources. So that's becoming a new trend that we're seeing as well. Let's see. So another thing that is of concern is we're calling it aggregate management. So insurance companies are trying to manage the amount of aggregate limits they have out there that are cat exposed. And again, that's a wildfire, it's earthquake, it's the cat exposures, and they're managing to a number. So one of the concerns that we're seeing is that as the year goes on, some of these carriers are getting to where they've put out their maximum amount of aggregate limit they can put out for the year. So we're very concerned that as people have later in the year renewals, that we might run out of capacity for some of that if you have a cat exposed account. If you don't have cat exposure, it's great, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that's really a challenge. We're seeing pressure on. We're seeing more pressure on pushing up attachment points, retentions. We're seeing less limits, and let me see what else is here. The only other thing I would add to this is and London's a great example of this. London is really relationship-driven market. They set their capital aside for their clients, and then if they have extra capital, then they'll go out and allocate that to new business. We're seeing now, because the delta between renewal pricing and new business, where the market's gotten so compressed that we're starting to see some carriers now kind of go after new business at 2 or 3x what they would do the renewal account for. So we're kind of seeing a reallocation of what capital they have too. So that's kind of a different change that we've seen as well. Yeah, we talked about the aggregate stuff. If there's anything else of significance here. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the large property programs are getting restructured, right? We're going from single carrier placements to quota shared and layered programs just because there aren't as many people out there that can put up the limits capacity. And the last thing I would just add is that when we're meeting with underwriters, I'll ask them, how many submissions are on your desk at a given point in time? And they'll literally say there's over 100 submissions on my desk at a given point in time. We're just inundated because they quote a renewal term It's not a good term. Then the client wants options, and then everybody's fighting the market for options and going out and marketing. So what does that mean? It means that we're not getting our numbers timely. I'm sure you're all experiencing to a certain extent where everything's taking longer and it's coming down to the wire to get stuff done. So that's the other piece of this. And the property market has really been pushed into the E&S marketplace. And then from a deductible perspective, we're seeing deductibles go up. Water damage is a big issue. In some cases, we're starting to see where they're allocating like a freeze deductible. Haven't seen it here yet, but we're seeing across the country where they might have a freeze deductible per location, kind of similar to how we'll see a wind hail percentage deductible being applied per location. That's a new trend. And then, we're still seeing similar wind hail percentage deductibles. Florida's been really difficult, and in Louisiana, wind hail exposure, you're seeing deductibles through the roof. You're seeing compressed limits, sub-limits for wind hail exposure. In a lot of cases, they're having trouble even getting coverage. So it's challenging. So what are we seeing from a terms and conditions perspective? So again, back to the valuations. If you don't have good values, you can expect to see restrictive terms, back to your question, where you're going to see margin clauses and things of that nature. You're going to see some language around that. They may not even quote, they may decline to quote, right? I mean, it's just like, well, I'm going to take this statement of value as a pristine statement of value. They've been keeping up year over year on their cost adjustments on their properties. Underwriters are going to be much more likely to underwrite that. If they feel like you haven't done that, they're going to quote it. They're going to increase the rate commensurate with the lack of increase in insurance to value. And I think those are kind of the key things that we're seeing right now. And then with that, I was just going to share with you just a couple of examples just to kind of give you a snapshot of what we're seeing over the last 90 days as far as some renewals, just to give you a little bit of a feel. So this is a county client that was on a shared and layered program and moved to a single carrier program, which again, it's not as easy to do, but it's a great win. The values went up. It looks like it went about $100 million in valuation, and loss limit went up a little bit too, it looks like. But the premium went up only 4%. Had it stayed in the prior shared and layered program, that renewal premium was going to be about 60% increase. So that was a huge win. The next one's a city example. This one, nothing changed from a terms and conditions perspective. The TIV increased a little bit, but we saw a 46% increase overall in premium. 15% of that was being driven by TIV, and the rest was being driven by rate. So, go to the next one. Here's a school district example. This particular school district is not in Colorado. They were with FM. They had a 3-year rate guarantee, and they basically got a flat renewal. They don't have the cat exposure either. They're actually in Arizona, but that's kind of, it's not the Colorado world that we're living in, but just an example to share with you. Then we've got another school district here that they had a $150 million loss limit. We could not get $150 million in capacity. We ended up renewing it at 115, so $35 million less in insurance than they had previously purchased. Kept the retention the same, but added a quota share retention where they're actually taking a 10% participation in a $15 million primary layer of insurance, which actually made sense because over the long term they would have saved money with that arrangement. But for less limit, taking more risk, they paid 36% more in insurance premium. They were contained to a county that's got wildfire exposure, it's got convective storm exposure, it's got concentration of risk. We didn't have as good of a spread of risks, which really made this one particularly challenging. Turn it back over to the casualty side.
Yep. And then go back to casualty. And so really from a high level, what we're seeing is moderate rate increases, barring any claims experience. Once you add in that claims experience and the social inflation, it has been and it will continue to be a major issue for us, and it's driving up prices, especially in Colorado. Capacity is slowly returning to the market, both in the primary and the excess layers, but it's coming in slowly. And then some stuff we're keeping an eye on is obviously nuclear verdicts and how that's affecting the climate. But also, we're keeping an eye on PFAS. And so PFAS, they call it a forever chemical. Many carriers are instituting exclusionary language for this PFAS. And if anybody can pronounce whatever it is, I'll buy you a beer. And then if not everyone's aware of this website, it's called Judicial Hellholes, and it's pretty self-explanatory. They rank the most litigious states, and no surprises, California, New York, and then I was a little bit surprised by the Georgia Supreme Court. Colorado tried to make the top 10, but we can only make the watch list. One thing that I thought was very interesting is in here how they say, we made the watch list because state legislatures' propensity to enact liability expanding legislation that targets the state's employers. And so that's directly what we're dealing with. And then moving forward, so this is City of Denver, and it's showing the claims payouts, settlement payouts for a couple years here. So I want to highlight SB 217.
This answers your question.
Yep, we're getting that. So SB 217 in 2020. And then after that was signed into law, look at how much higher the claims payouts were, with 2022 being $3.5 million. So,
And that's predominantly police and sheriff, the darker blue lines there. So that's a significant upward trend since 2017 was passed.
And those include the 15 million in Clear Creek recently and.
No, that doesn't, because that settled in 2023. Yeah. So that's the next slide, right?
So, everyone's familiar with this claim. It's sad, but $19 million settlement to the Glass family. It's the largest in the state's history. The state of Colorado and 3 other municipalities were involved in it. And so it's our job to look at this and say, how is that going to affect pricing? How is that going to affect the structure of policies? And really, when we look at this, we're going to see increased pricing, obviously, increased retentions, and capacity coming down. Because this is bringing the underwriter and the carrier's attention to Colorado and to the laws we have enacted here. And then cyber, where we're going with cyber's a tale of 2 stories. Either we did the work, got the controls in place, and you went through that terrible process of putting all the controls in place, and we're seeing flat renewals, some even decreases. So very favorable renewals if you've done the work and got the controls in place. However, if we're still struggling to get things like MFA implemented or air gap backups, we're still seeing struggles with pricing in the market, and we're seeing struggles finding limit as well if you don't have the controls in place.
And the caveat I would add to that is just, it really impacts ransomware, which as most of you probably know. It's really, the MFA and all those issues are really tied around. You can still get cyber insurance, but if you don't have those in place, you're going to have a really low sublimit for ransomware, or maybe no limit. So, and then once you get them implemented, most of the carriers will eliminate those sublimits.
So a little bit more on the cyber market. It's really become a much more mature market, and we're seeing a lot of competition coming out of these carriers, and they're able to offer more capacity. Obviously, that's if you have the controls in place, but the capacity is there. But they're also getting more sophisticated with how they're underwriting and how they're doing their scans of your systems and everything. The cyber risk, it remains high, and it's still changing. And so there's going to be new risks that come up, like AI. AI is something we're watching, and we're seeing how it's going to affect the market. Claims activity this year was actually up the first quarter of this year. So cyber's not going away, and the issues we have with it. And then lastly, we're almost done, workers' comp. So workers' comp moving forward, we're keeping an eye on medical inflation and how that's driving claims costs. As you see, so this blue line is the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and that's the medical inflation index. And so it's outpacing the CPI by quite a bit, and that's driving up medical costs and claims costs and ultimately pricing. That's it.
Yeah, so we'll open it up for me. I know we kind of ran late and long today. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, well, thank you guys. All right, real quick, we'll get everyone out of here. Our next meeting is our annual conference at the Hythe Vale, August 6th through 8th. Everyone get signed up. It's going to be a great event. Also, next month, we're going to be promoting a webinar put on by Clear Risk, the importance of data collection and the impact of it on total cost of risk. Look for an email coming out from the chapter on that for everyone to sign up and attend that. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you all in Vail.